We're going to start on tutorial in I, refocus and vector mask. There's several here in this first folder on refocusing. We're going to start with the lens blur. These are very short tutorials. There's also instructions in there, a PDF of instructions. So this first image here, let's start out by duplicating that layer, Command J. I'm going to call this cafe. And now if we check in with our instructions, um, there's something we haven't done before. We are going to add a layer mask. So I've got this cafe selected, and this particular button down here on the layers, it looks like a rectangle with a circle next to effects. I'm going to click that button. That's going to add us a layer mask. And you'll notice if I select with my little hand here, it'll put a highlighted box around either one of these. I want to select the cafe and I want to shift click, and that puts an X over it. Now if you check our instructions, we're going to use a lens blur filter. But first we have to use the gradient tool, and we're going to drag across it. So let's find that gradient tool. So the gradient tool is right here, and I'm going to just simply drag from one end to the other end with that gradient tool. And that's X'd out right there. Now I'm going to select the other image, the actual cafe, and I am going to go into my filter, blur, lens blur. Now make sure this won't work if you have the gradient selected. You have to select the image. Now we're going to play around with some of these buttons here. So I'll just have my preview on so I can see what happens. I'm going to put my source is a layer mask. So see how it's blurring it in the angle of that gradient. Now just go ahead and play around with what the focal detail, what happens when you do that. You can change the radius so it is much stronger. You can, try out all of these. Rotation, blow curve, it's definitely going to change that blur. If you want to add some noise, that's not really the look I'm looking for. I want this particular photo to look like I took it with a really nice camera. It's not a flat image, it has a foreground and a background. So I'm just going to take away the radius a little bit and just go through some of these and see what they do. I can change the threshold of this image as well, and I can decide if it's uniform or Gaussian blur. Um, Now I can also click to invert it. So I'm going to go ahead and get that focal distance, and the radius changes the blur quite a bit. So it really looks like it's focusing in on these foreground, but if I invert it, it looks like I focused on the background and the chairs closest to me are blurred. And that is how the lens blur, you can fix that to make it look like you have focused in on a subject area. I'm going to hit OK, and it has applied it to this image here, and you can see how that gradient as a little vector mask we've added in there, how that works. So let's move on to our next tutorial. Let's move to number 2, fill blur. Okay, so in number 2, it's also in our directions. I have them open here. Applying a fill blur, an iris blur, and a tilt shift. We're going to do all three of these. So first let's start with a fill blur. So we want to make that coffee look hot. So I'm going to go to filter. So first I'm going to copy this image. I'm going to do that Command J, and I'm going to rename this hot coffee. So we want to actually see that steam coming off the cup there. So it says in the name of the file what the directions are. Even this is a fill blur. The next one's an iris. And number four will be a tilt shift. So I'm going to actually go into my tools and just pick a elliptical marquee. And I'm just going to pick this area here where I feel like it would be the steamiest coming out of her cup. Now we're going to go into filter, blur gallery. We're going to try that first one, fill blur. If you notice, it's the same as the name on the file here. And it gives me this ring. I can actually change, where that pen goes, and I can change the amount of blur in here or over here in the filled bar. And I just want to add a little bit there. You can add, try some of this selection bleed a little bit. And let's see, I'm going to hit OK. Hit Command D. And let's see what that looks like. Command D. And it's just blurred right here in her hair and above the cuff, and it looks hot and steamy. Let's move on to the next one. Three, iris blur. This is really very simple. It's in the same filter, blur gallery, iris blur. And it puts this ring around here, and I can pick the amount of blur. So iris, like your eye. So it's going to have that focal point in the center. It's that oval eye shape. You can move it around and position it so it's more square on the edges, even if you like. You can also move the inner ring or use the iris blur little handle here. You can also change that pen around a little bit if you prefer to move the focal point or set a new pen. And you see how it blurs all the other edges. I'm going to actually blur it quite a lot so you can see the difference here. I'm going to hit return. OK. And it blurs out everything but that main part in the iris. Okay, so the next one is tilt shift blur. We're going to go into filter, blur gallery. Let's try that tilt shift. Now this one is really interesting because it makes it look like a little toy town almost. So we're blurring out those edges, and I can tilt and shift it, and I can also move these lines around to decide how much the blur goes into it. This always reminds me of like the intro to Game of Thrones. It feels like a little toy town there with the filter. Okay, so when you are happy with the amount of blur, hit OK or return. And that is a tilt shift blur. And it feels like these are little tiny toys now. All right, so I think we are done with the first part. I will pick back up with another